Welcome to today's deep dive. Fasten your seatbelts, folks, because we're about to embark on a global journey.
A journey exploring the lives and experiences of Indigenous peoples as we enter a new millennium.
Exactly. We're time traveling back to 1999-2000.
A pivotal period for Indigenous rights worldwide.
And our trusty compass for this trip?
Indigenous World, 1999-2000.
An incredible publication.
Compiled by IWGIA.
The International Work Group for Indigenous Affairs.
They've put together this amazing overview.
Covering everything.
From land rights and cultural preservation
to health
and international legal frameworks.
So IWGIA.
They're known for their in-depth research and advocacy.
And their Indigenous World series.
Well, let me tell you, it's essential reading for anyone.
Anyone who wants to grasp the complex realities that Indigenous communities face.
Now, the way this book is structured,
it's geographically organized.
with chapters dedicated to 7 distinct regions.
Let's see, we've got the Arctic, North and Central America,
South America, the Pacific, and Australia.
Southeast Asia,
South Asia, and Africa.
This regional approach is really smart.
It allows you to appreciate the incredible diversity of Indigenous cultures.
And their unique experiences.
But here's the thing. As you delve deeper,
you start noticing these connecting threads.
These commonalities that link them all.
It's like a tapestry, you know?
With all these different colors and textures.
But woven together into a single, intricate design.
And speaking of threads,
one that seems to pop up everywhere.
Sadly, it's land rights.
Conflicts over land ownership.
And resource extraction.
They appear to be a universal struggle.
A struggle for so many Indigenous peoples.
It's like whether we're talking about oil drilling in the Arctic,
or mining in the Amazon,
or those massive development projects in Southeast Asia.
The pattern's undeniably clear.
Indigenous lands are often targeted.
Targeted for their valuable resources.
And all too frequently.
It happens without proper consultation.
Or even consent.
It's a heartbreaking reality.
But amidst these struggles,
there's this incredible strength.
This resilience you see.
As these communities fight back.
Pushing for self-determination.
You know that term, self-determination?
It's more than just a trendy phrase, isn't it?
Absolutely. It's about Indigenous peoples having the inherent right.
The right to freely determine their political status.
And to pursue their economic, social, and cultural development.
And this book.
It's brimming with examples of Indigenous peoples doing just that.
Through political movements, like what we see in Bolivia and Ecuador.
Or through direct action and resistance.
Like the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico. Now, speaking of Chiapas,
the book also digs deep into cultural preservation.
Which feels incredibly crucial.
Especially with all the pressure to assimilate. Forced assimilation, historically.
It's been a tool of colonization.
But Indigenous peoples are actively fighting back.
They're revitalizing their languages.
Passing down traditional knowledge.
Making sure their cultures thrive.
Thrive for generations to come.
It's a true testament to their resilience.
A powerful reminder that we need to cherish cultural diversity.
Not try to erase it.
But the book doesn't shy away from the tough realities either.
You know, like those health and social issues.
Yeah.
Indigenous communities often bear the brunt of disproportionate poverty.
Healthcare disparities.
And discrimination.
The book examines this with nuance.
Exploring the systemic factor.
Those factors driving these inequalities.
While also showcasing the amazing work.
The work Indigenous organizations are doing to tackle these issues head on.
So if we take a step back.
And look at the bigger picture.
What's the overall message of this book?
It's a mixed bag, really.
A complex tapestry.
On one hand, we see Indigenous peoples globally facing significant challenges.
Like the dispossession of land.
Threats to their cultures.
Persistent social inequities.
But on the other hand, there's this incredible strength.
A resilience that shines through.
This unwavering determination.
The determination to fight for their rights.
And safeguard their heritage.
You know, one thing I found really helpful were the maps.
The maps, visually representing Indigenous territories.
They were so clear.
Those maps are more than just geographical markers.
They're like visual stories.
Representing histories, identities.
And generations of connection to the land.
They're powerful reminders of those deep roots.
Those roots Indigenous peoples have in their territories. All right, I think we've laid a pretty good foundation.
A solid starting point.
So where should we dive in first?
How about we head north?
North to the Arctic.
Exactly. The book highlights some unique challenges.
Challenges faced by Indigenous peoples there.
Challenges brought on by climate change.
And environmental degradation. You know, it's one thing to read about climate change in general.
But when you see how it directly impacts Communities?
Communities who depend on the land for survival.
It really hits home.
The Arctic is literally at the forefront of this global crisis.
Rising temperatures, melting ice, shifting wildlife patterns.
They're all having a direct impact on the traditional ways of life.
The ways of life of Arctic indigenous communities.
Like the Inuit in Canada and Greenland.
Or the Sami in Scandinavia.
Their hunting, fishing, and herding practices.
They're all being disrupted.
It's a stark reminder of why urgent climate action is needed.
And why indigenous voices need to be at the center of those conversations.
They hold generations of knowledge.
Knowledge about adapting to changing environments.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit.
And head south.
To North and Central America.
Yes. One thing that really stood out to me
was the ongoing battle for treaty rights
by Native American tribes in the U.S.
and First Nations in Canada.
It's a powerful reminder that colonialism's impact.
It's long-lasting.
And that the fight for justice is far from over.
These struggles are rooted in centuries of broken promises.
And those assimilation policies.
This isn't ancient history.
It's their present reality.
They're still fighting for recognition.
Recognition of their sovereignty.
And the fulfillment of those treaty obligations.
Especially when it comes to land claims, resource management.
And cultural preservation.
Understanding that historical context.
It's crucial if we want to grasp the contemporary challenges.
The challenges indigenous communities face today.
And then there's the Zapatista uprising in Chiapas, Mexico.
Back in the 1990s.
The book delves into its implications for indigenous autonomy.
Could you unpack that a bit more?
Absolutely. The Zapatista uprising was a major turning point.
Led by the Zapatista Army of National Liberation.
Which was largely made up of indigenous Mayan people.
They declared war against the Mexican state.
On January 1st, 1994.
The same day NAFTA came into effect.
Wow. That's quite a statement.
Choosing that specific date.
It was a direct challenge to those neoliberal policies.
And a powerful assertion of indigenous self-determination.
They demanded recognition.
Recognition of their rights to land, resources.
And self-governance.
They wanted control over their own community.
Their own education system.
Their own destinies.
So how did the Mexican government respond?
Initially, with military force.
Makes sense.
However, the Zapatistas gained a lot of support.
National and international support.
Which forced the government into negotiations.
Did they achieve their goals?
It's complicated.
A mixed bag, you might say.
While there have been some concessions.
The Zapatistas continue to face threats.
Threats from paramilitary groups.
And government forces.
But the incredible thing is,
they've actually built these autonomous communities in Chiapas.
With their own schools, healthcare systems.
These governance structures.
And it's a powerful example of indigenous resistance.
And creating alternative models of living.
It really highlights the potential of collective action.
In the pursuit of self-determination. Okay, let's keep moving south.
Down to South America.
What's happening there?
In the South America, we see indigenous communities confronting
massive development projects.
Things like dams and mines being built in the Amazon rainforest.
It sounds like a classic David versus Goliath scenario.
You could say that.
The Amazon is a biodiversity hotspot.
Home to countless indigenous cultures, many living in voluntary isolation.
Development projects like these.
They threaten not just their lands and livelihoods,
but their very existence. But it's not all doom and gloom, right?
And not at all. The book also points to the growing political participation
of indigenous groups in countries like Bolivia and Ecuador.
That's a significant development.
It's encouraging to see them gaining a seat at the table.
It really demonstrates the power of mobilization.
And the increasing recognition of indigenous rights in some countries.
The struggles persist, of course.
But these are definitely steps in the right direction.
Steps towards self-determination.
Okay, let's hop across the Pacific now.
To the Pacific and Australia.
What's the story there?
Australia has this long and troubled history with colonization.
And its impact on Aboriginal Australians.
It's been devastating.
Their history is deeply marked by colonization.
And the loss of their land.
The impact of British colonization on Aboriginal Australians.
It's been nothing short of catastrophic.
From forced removals and cultural suppression.
To the ongoing fight for basic recognition and land rights.
It's a truly painful chapter in history.
But despite these injustices,
Aboriginal Australians continue to
fight for their rights, their cultures,
and their connection to their ancestral lands. What about Pacific Islander communities?
They face their own unique set of challenges.
Often stemming from the legacy of colonialism,
environmental degradation,
and the ripple effects of globalization,
land tenure, resource management,
and cultural preservation.
They're all major concerns.
It's like this recurring theme
This pattern of challenges
faced by an indigenous people.
in such vastly different parts of the world, it highlights how interconnected their experiences truly are.
And how these injustices
Often have roots in those historical events.
and those ongoing systemic issues. All right, onward to Southeast Asia,
A region teeming with a vast array of indigenous groups,
often referred to as hill tribes.
or tribal people,
They're facing displacement, marginalization.
and the loss of their traditional lands and resources.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Of course, the Hum in Laos,
The Cairn in Burma,
and numerous indigenous groups in Thailand.
they're all confronting pressure.
Pressure from development projects, deforestation.
And government policies that fail to recognize their rights.
It seems like these hill tribes are up against many of the same pressures.
The same pressures we've seen elsewhere.
Land grabs, resource extraction.
And assimilationist policies.
It really underscores the need for greater recognition.
Recognition of indigenous rights and self-determination in Southeast Asia. Now, let's journey to South Asia.
For the book sheds light on the Adivasi peoples of India
And their ongoing struggle for recognition.
and the protection of their traditional lands. The term Adivasi actually means original inhabitants,
It encompasses a diverse group of indigenous peoples in India.
facing remarkably similar challenges.
Land alienation, displacement, and discrimination. It seems like those land rights.
They truly are at the heart of so many of these struggles.
You're absolutely right. For indigenous peoples, land is more than just a resource.
It's deeply intertwined with their identities, cultures.
And their spiritual beliefs. Okay, final destination, Africa.
A continent often overlooked in discussions of indigenous peoples.
What insights does the book offer?
In Africa, we see pastoralist communities like the Maasai.
Facing conflicts with governments over land use.
Their traditional grazing practices,
Often clash with government policies.
policies that prioritize things like settled agriculture or conservation.
It's like a clash of worldviews.
A clash between different ways of relating to the land.
The Maasai have this profound understanding of their ecosystem.
They've managed their land sustainably for generations.
But those traditional practices are sometimes seen as incompatible.
Incompatible with modern development or conservation models.
It sounds like a delicate balancing act.
It is. Finding solutions that respect both ecological integrity.
And the cultural rights of indigenous peoples is paramount. Wow, we've covered an incredible amount of ground today.
It's remarkable how much we've already explored,
And we've only scratched the surface of each region.
each with its own unique complexities.
We could easily dedicate an entire deep dive to each one.
But before we get carried away,
There's one more crucial element from the book we need to address.
part 2 of the book.
You're talking about the draft declaration on the rights of indigenous peoples.
That's right.
This feels like a pivotal moment.
A turning point in the story of indigenous rights.
Can you give us the rundown?
Absolutely. In 1999-2000,
The UN was working on this draft declaration.
aimed at creating a global set of standards.
Standards for protecting indigenous rights worldwide.
Imagine a world where those rights
Rights to self-determination, their lands, their cultures,
and their right to free, prior, and informed consent.
were universally recognized and protected.
It would be groundbreaking.
Given the struggles we've been discussing.
It does seem a bit idealistic.
A bit utopian.
It's certainly aspirational.
But that's the power of a declaration like this.
It establishes a goal.
A standard to strive for. So if it was so important,
Why was it so difficult to get it adopted?
the book mentioned some strong opposition
The concerns often centered around sovereignty.
and how it might affect existing legal frameworks.
Some governments were worried that recognizing indigenous people's right to self-determination
Could potentially lead to separatist movements.
or undermine national unity
So the fear was that indigenous peoples might try to break away.
and form their own independent nations.
That was one concern, yes.
Others argued that the Declaration's language on land rights
Could clash with existing property laws.
or hinder economic development.
It's like that age-old power struggle, isn't it?
Those in power reluctant to relinquish control or resources.
A fair point.
But it's crucial to remember,
Indigenous peoples have been advocating for their rights for centuries.
long before this declaration came about,
Right, this declaration was more about formalizing those rights.
on an international stage,
And even though it wasn't adopted in 1999-2000,
the fact that it was being debated at the UN,
it was a major victory in itself.
it gave indigenous voices a platform.
And put pressure on states to take action.
Exactly. It laid the groundwork for what would eventually become
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007.
Wait, so it actually was adopted eventually?
It was, after years of negotiations and advocacy,
It wasn't a perfect document.
and some states still had reservations.
But it was a monumental achievement. I'm curious.
What are you curious about?
What were some of the differences between that initial draft from 1999-2000?
And the final version adopted in 2007. There were some key changes
Mostly around the language.
and strengthening certain aspects.
For instance, the final version.
It included stronger affirmation
Affirmations of the right of Indigenous peoples,
to free, prior, and informed consent.
especially concerning development projects.
Projects impacting their lands and resources,
That's a vital distinction.
ensuring Indigenous peoples have a genuine say in decisions,
Decisions affecting their lives.
not just going through the motions of consultation.
It shifts the power dynamic in a significant way.
Absolutely.
This has been a fascinating look at this declaration.
Thank you for breaking it all down. It's a complex issue, but incredibly important.
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples provides a valuable framework.
A framework for understanding and addressing those historical injustices
And those ongoing challenges.
faced by Indigenous communities worldwide.
All right, before we wrap up this first part of our deep dive,
A quick question for you, dear listener.
what's resonated with you the most so far?
What sparked your curiosity?
Take a moment to ponder what you've learned.
Was it the impact of climate change on Arctic communities?
Or the struggle for tree rights in North America?
The resistance to development in the Amazon?
Or the fight for recognition in Australia?
Whatever it is, hold on to that thought.
We'll continue our exploration in the next part of our deep dive.
There's a whole world of Indigenous knowledge, history, and perspectives waiting to be uncovered.
See you soon.
Until next time. Welcome back to our deep dive into Indigenous World 1999-2000.
It's great to be back.
Now, before we jump back into those fascinating regional stories,
Okay.
let's circle back to that draft declaration.
The Draft Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
Exactly.
Yes, I keep thinking about it.
It's such a crucial moment.
In the global fight for Indigenous rights,
Absolutely. Imagine a world
a world where
where Indigenous people's rights to self-determination, their lands, their cultures,
and their right to free, prior, and informed consent.
are universally recognized and protected.
It would be revolutionary.
Truly groundbreaking.
Given the struggles we've been discussing, though, it
Right.
does feel a bit idealistic.
A bit utopian, you might say.
Yeah.
But that's the power of a declaration like this. It sets a benchmark.
A goal to work towards. But if it was so important,
I know what you're going to say.
why was it so difficult to get adopted?
Ah, yes. The opposition.
The book mentioned quite a bit of pushback.
Well, a lot of the concerns revolved around sovereignty.
Sovereignty.
Yes, and the potential impact on existing legal systems.
I see.
Some governments worried.
Worried that recognizing Indigenous people's right to self-determination could lead to what?
To separatist movements,
Oh, okay.
or that it might threaten national unity.
So basically,
They were afraid that Indigenous peoples might try to secede
to break away.
and form their own independent countries.
Right.
That was one fear. Yeah.
Are there others?
Oh, absolutely. Some argued that the Declaration's language on land rights could conflict with existing property laws
Ah.
or potentially hinder economic development.
It's that same old power struggle, isn't it?
It often is,
Those in power.
reluctant to share control or resources.
You're right.
It's a familiar dynamic, sadly.
But it's crucial to remember
What's that?
that Indigenous peoples have been fighting for these rights
For centuries.
long before this declaration even existed.
Exactly.
So this is more about formalizing those rights.
Formalizing them on a global stage.
I see.
And even though it wasn't adopted in 1999-2000,
Right.
the very fact that it was being discussed at the UN,
Yeah,
that was a huge victory in itself.
it was.
Absolutely. It put pressure on governments.
Pressure to address these issues.
And it gave Indigenous voices a global platform.
You're right. That's significant.
It really was.
And it also paved the way
Paved the way for what?
for what would eventually become.
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples,
Oh, wow.
adopted by the UN General Assembly in 2007.
Wait, so it actually did get adopted eventually?
It did.
That's amazing.
It took years of negotiations and advocacy.
Of course.
And it's not a perfect document by any means.
I understand.
Some states still had reservations,
It
but it was landmark achievement nonetheless.
really was.
A historic moment.
Now I'm curious,
So,
What were some of the key differences
Okay.
between that initial draft from 1999-2000
Right.
and the final version adopted in 2007?
Well, there were some subtle but crucial changes.
Such as?
For example, the final version.
Yeah.
It had much stronger affirmation
Affirmations of what?
of Indigenous people's right to free, prior, and informed consent, especially when it came to development projects.
Projects affecting their lands and resources.
Precisely.
That's a big deal.
It is.
It's not just about being consulted.
Right.
It's about having a real say in decisions.
Decisions that directly impact their lives.
Exact.
It's a critical shift.
A shift in the power dynamic.
You got it.
This has been so informative.
I'm glad you found it helpful.
Thank you for explaining all of that.
My pleasure.
The Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is such an important document.
It really helps us understand
Those historical injustices
and the ongoing challenges.
faced by Indigenous communities worldwide.
You're absolutely right.
So, are we ready to continue our exploration of the different regions?
Let's do it.
I think we left off in Africa,
Yes, Africa.
a continent often overlooked.
Overlooked when discussing Indigenous peoples.
Sadly, it's true.
They're facing many of the same challenges.
Challenges we've talked about.
Land dispossession
Cultural suppression.
and persistent discrimination,
The book highlighted pastoralist communities
like the Maasai,
and their struggle over land use,
which is so relevant today.
especially with the current conversation around conservation.
You're right.
The Maasai,
They're a perfect example of that tension
tension between
their traditional way of life
centered around cattle herding,
and migrating with the seasons
right,
and government policies,
that favors settling down and farming.
or those focused solely on conservation.
It's easy to see how that could create conflict.
It does.
These different ways of relating to the land,
The Maasai have this deep understanding.
an understanding of their ecosystem.
They've managed their land sustainably for centuries.
Yeah.
But their traditional practices,
They're often seen as incompatible,
incompatible with modern development.
or conservation models.
It's a challenge.
A real challenge.
Finding solutions that respect both ecological integrity.
And the cultural rights of Indigenous peoples.
It's crucial.
Absolutely.
We need to find that balance
A balance where
where competing interests can coexist,
and
where Indigenous voices are included.
included in the decision-making process. Okay, let's head back to Asia.
Sounds good.
What were some of the key takeaways for you?
Takeaways regarding Indigenous experiences in South Asia. The situation of the Adivasi peoples in India
Yes.
is particularly striking,
They make up a significant portion of India's population.
yet they face ongoing marginalization.
And discrimination.
It's a sad reality.
The book talked about their fight for recognition
Recognition of their land rights.
and the protection of their traditional lands.
For decades they've been fighting.
For their land rights.
Their lands often hold valuable natural resources, prime targets for development projects.
Or resource extraction.
Unfortunately, it's a familiar story,
It is.
but despite the challenges,
The Adivasi continue to resist,
they're organizing, raising awareness.
demanding justice.
It's inspiring, isn't it?
It is.
Their resilience, their determination.
It underscores the fact that the fight for Indigenous rights
It's a global one
happening everywhere.
in every corner of the world.
All right, let's move on to Southeast Asia.
Okay,
What are some of the key things we need to understand?
about Indigenous peoples in that region. Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
It's incredibly diverse,
Diverse in terms of,
both its cultures and geography.
I can imagine.
There are hundreds of distinct Indigenous groups,
Wow, hundreds.
each with their own unique languages, traditions.
And ways of life.
The book used the term hill tribes.
To describe some of these groups.
Right, but it's important to remember
What's that?
that not all Indigenous peoples embrace that label.
I see.
Some view it as a colonial term, a term that lumps them together.
And ignores their unique identities.
Exactly.
Way makes sense.
It's always crucial to use respectful language.
And acknowledge how different groups self-identify.
I couldn't agree more.
So, when we look at the challenges,
Challenges faced by Indigenous peoples in Southeast Asia. We see those familiar patterns again.
patterns of their
Land dispossession
displacement from their ancestral lands
and pressures to assimilate.
to assimilate to the dominant culture.
It's a recurring theme.
Can you give us some concrete examples?
Sure. For example, in Laos,
Okay.
the Anglophone people,
Yes.
they face decades of marginalization,
and displacement.
often because of conflict,
Conflict
development projects,
or
government policies,
that prioritize.
the needs of lowland communities.
So it's not just pressure from outside forces.
Yeah.
It's also those dynamics within the countries themselves.
Exactly.
In some cases,
Indigenous peoples are caught
between government policies, the
Yeah.
interests of more dominant ethnic groups.
within their own countries.
It adds another layer of complexity
It does.
to an already complex situation.
So we need to address those internal dynamics
Absolutely.
in addition to those broader global forces.
That impact indigenous communities.
Okay, let's shift our focus now.
To the Pacific and Australia.
All right.
What are some of the major issues?
Facing indigenous peoples there. Australia in particular
Yes.
has a long and complicated history
A history of colonization.
and the impact on Aboriginal Australians.
It's been
You're
devastating.
talking about generations of trauma
Trauma from forced assimilation policies.
and cultural suppression.
All stemming from that initial land dispossession.
It's a heartbreaking legacy.
The book made it clear
What did it make clear?
that Aboriginal Australians are still fighting
Fighting for recognition.
and for their land rights,
It's an ongoing battle.
despite decades of activism and legal challenges
They still face systemic discrimination
and a lack of control.
over their ancestral lands.
It's a harsh reminder
A reminder of what?
that colonialism casts a long shadow.
And that the pursuit of justice?
It requires constant effort.
It's crucial to remember
To remember what?
that even within Australia,
Yes.
there's a rich diversity.
A diversity of Aboriginal cultures and experiences
There are over 250 distinct language groups,
across the country.
each with its own unique history and traditions.
Wow, that's incredible.
It is.
What about the Pacific Islander community?
What about them?
What are they facing?
The Pacific Islands face their own unique set of challenges.
Challenges stemming from
The lingering impacts of colonialism
the increasing pressures of climate change.
and the effects of globalization,
Climate change.
Yes.
That's a particularly urgent issue.
especially for those island nations.
You're right.
Rising sea levels
More frequent extreme weather.
and ocean acidification
They're all threatening the very existence.
of some Pacific Island communities.
It's a stark reminder.
Reminder that we need to take action
Urgent climate action.
and center the voices.
Give voices of those most affected
Absolutely. Indigenous peoples, especially those on the front lines,
of climate change.
they hold valuable knowledge.
Knowledge about adaptation and resilience.
Their perspectives are vital.
Vital to any global climate negotiations.
And policy decisions.
Okay, let's wrap up our regional tour.
Back in the Americas.
South America specifically.
Yes.
What are some of the biggest themes?
That emerged when looking at indigenous peoples there. South America.
Yes.
It's home to the Amazon rainforest.
One of the most biodiverse regions on the planet.
And it's also home to...
To a vast array of indigenous cultures.
The book highlighted their resistance.
Resistance to those massive development projects.
Like dams and mines.
Happening in the Amazon.
Those projects often lead to deforestation.
And displace entire communities.
They cause serious environmental degradation.
Threatening livelihoods.
And cultural survival.
Of the indigenous peoples who call the Amazon home.
It's a complex issue.
It brings up that question.
Question of what?
Of balancing economic development.
With environmental protection. It does.
And it raises those ethical questions.
But who benefits from these projects?
And who pays the price?
The important questions to consider.
The book also mentioned the growing political participation
Of indigenous groups.
in countries like Bolivia and Ecuador.
It's a positive development.
It is.
Indigenous peoples are mobilizing, organizing
Gaining political representation
to advocate for their rights.
within their own countries. It feels like a sign of progress,
It does.
even if there's still a long way to go.
There's always more work to be done.
But it shows how important it is
Important to do what?
to support indigenous-led movements
And to ensure that
that they have a voice
a voice in decisions being made.
about their lands, their resources.
Their futures.
We've covered so much ground in this deep dive.
We have.
It's amazing.
We've only scratched the surface.
But I feel like I've gained a new perspective
A glimpse into the diversity, resilience, and strength.
of indigenous peoples around the world.
I'm glad to hear that.
As we wrap up this second part of our deep dive,
Yes.
I have a question for our listeners.
Okay, what is it?
Think about all the different regions we've discussed.
From the Arctic to Africa,
What connections or patterns have you noticed?
what surprised you the most?
And how does all of this knowledge inform your understanding of the world today? And we're back for the final leg of our deep dive into Indigenous World 1999-2000.
It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've crisscrossed the globe.
Exploring indigenous experiences
From the icy Arctic.
to the vibrant landscapes of Africa.
And it's amazing how these diverse
Communities spread across continents,
are all connected.
connected by these common threads.
Threads of resilience, resistance,
Absolutely. Land rights, self-determination.
cultural preservation.
These themes,
They weave through every story.
every region we've explored.
You know, one thing that really struck me
What's that?
was how the book emphasized
Emphasized what?
that for many indigenous peoples,
Land isn't just a commodity.
it's much deeper than that.
It's the foundation of their culture,
Their identity.
their spiritual well-being.
It's like their connection to the land.
It's not just about ownership.
It's about something much more profound.
You've hit on a key point.
It makes you think
Makes you think about what?
about the challenges
The challenges of reconciling indigenous worldviews.
with those dominant societal structures
Structures that often prioritize economic growth.
over cultural or environmental concerns.
That tension,
It really comes through in the book.
doesn't it?
Indigenous peoples are constantly at odds.
At odds with development projects,
Resource extraction,
government policies,
policies that just don't recognize their unique rights.
or their perspective.
And the examples
They're everywhere.
from mining in the Amazon
To oil drilling in the Arctic.
to land grabs for development in Southeast Asia.
It's a global pattern.
It's heartbreaking to see how often this happens.
It is.
But it also makes those international legal frameworks.
Like the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples.
They seem even more important.
You're right.
Those declarations.
They're not a magic solution.
But they do give Indigenous peoples a tool
A tool for advocacy.
and a way to hold states accountable.
Accountable for their actions.
You know, speaking of holding strong,
What are you thinking about?
I'm so impressed by the resilience
The resilience of indigenous communities.
in the face of all these challenges.
They've faced centuries of oppression
Yet they continue to resist, adapt.
and fight for self-determination.
It's truly inspiring.
They're revitalizing their language,
Preserving their traditions.
finding creative ways to thrive.
In a rapidly changing world, one thing that really stuck with me
What was that?
was the discussion of cultural preservation.
Oh, yes.
It's clear that indigenous languages and cultures
They're under constant pressure.
pressure to assimilate,
We've seen throughout history,
how those forced assimilation policies,
they've been used as a tool
a tool of colonization,
with the goal of erasing indigenous identities
forcing them to conform.
or conform to the dominant society.
It's encouraging, though,
What's encouraging?
to see indigenous communities
Reclaiming their cultures,
and making sure they're passed on.
passed on to future generations. That's a vital part of this story.
It's not just about preserving the past.
It's about ensuring the vitality
the vitality of indigenous cultures
in the present.
and the future. So how does all of this connect
Connect to what?
to the bigger picture?
The wood picture.
What can we learn from Indigenous World 1999-2000?
What's relevant to our lives today, I think the most important takeaway
Is what?
is the need to understand and respect
Understand and respect what?
indigenous perspectives,
Regardless of the issue.
whether it's climate change
Land management.
or social justice,
Indigenous peoples bring valuable knowledge.
and unique insights.
They've been stewards of their lands.
And their cultures,
a generation.
their voices deserve to be heard.
We can learn so much from them.
About sustainability,
Resilience.
living in harmony with the natural world.
It's a reminder
A reminder of what?
that we're all interconnected
Regardless of borders.
and that we have a responsibility
A responsibility to protect the rights and well-being,
of everyone.
including indigenous communities.
Well said.
As we wrap up our deep dive,
Okay,
I want to leave you with this thought.
go on.
Indigenous World, 1999-2000.
It offers a snapshot.
A snapshot of a particular moment in time.
I see.
Think about how things have evolved.
Evolved for indigenous peoples.
Since then,
What progress has been made?
what challenges remain?
And how can we contribute?
Contribute to a more just and equitable future.
A future for indigenous peoples worldwide. It's a powerful call to action.
It is.
Thank you for guiding us through this exploration.
My pleasure.
Remember, everyone,
Knowledge is power
but it only becomes truly valuable
when we use it.
to create positive change.
Keep learning.
Stay engaged.
Advocate for a world
where indigenous voices are amplified.
and their rights are respected.
That's a perfect note to end on.
Until next time,
Keep exploring.
stay curious.
And remember,
Every deep
is an
dive
opportunity.
to learn and grow.
Thanks for joining us.
See you next time.